Welcome. I'm Matt Cancian. I'm an associate professor at the Naval War College here at CSIS for the rollout event for a report I'm one of the 3 co-authors of, Confronting Armageddon, Wargaming Nuclear Deterrence and Its Failures in a U.S. China Conflict over Taiwan. And to begin with, we'll send it over to my other 2 co-authors to introduce the report and discuss some of the main results.
Welcome. I'm Mark Cancian, one of the 3 authors of the report Confronting Armageddon, Wargaming Nuclear Deterrence and Its Failures in a U.S. China Conflict over Taiwan. I'm a retired Marine colonel and a senior advisor here at CSIS. I'm joined by my colleague Eric Heginbotham.
I'm Eric Heginbotham, a principal research scientist at MIT's Security Studies Program and co-director of the program's Wargaming Lab.
We're going to give a quick 10-minute overview of the report. I'll start with the project and the wargame. Eric will discuss the findings and recommendations. This project arose because any conflict between nuclear-armed powers raises the possibility of nuclear weapons use and escalation. Such use is not inevitable, but it is possible, and the project sought to investigate those nuclear dynamics. I want to give the bottom line up front so everybody knows where we're going. There are 4 things I want to emphasize in this summary. Nuclear weapons were used when one side thought it was facing catastrophic defeat on the conventional battlefield. The United States does not need to accept unfavorable outcomes. However, it is critical to give China a way out without forcing a choice between humiliating defeat and nuclear use. And finally, achieving a total victory, like overthrowing the CCP or disarming China, was not achievable when the adversary is armed with nuclear weapons. The research team developed the wargame for a previous project to examine a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. This project made several adaptations, including the possibility of using nuclear weapons. The 2 research questions ask why adversaries might use nuclear weapons and what happens when they do. On the disclaimers, I want to emphasize that everything, the research and the resulting products, came completely from unclassified sources. I also want to emphasize that although many participants held or had held senior positions in government, gameplay reflected their personal judgments and not any plan of the U.S. government. The report discusses the game mechanics in detail. I'll give a quick overview here. It's a physical game with about 1,000 pieces. Here are the operational maps where players move their air and naval forces. The game begins with a conventional conflict. There's a ground map of Taiwan where the ground campaign takes place. And finally, there's a nuclear status map where players could change their nuclear posture and decide to use nuclear weapons. Teams were not required to use nuclear weapons, and many did not, but some did. Scoping conditions are important in understanding what the war game does and does not do. The key limitation is that the political dimension was not fully represented, and therefore the frequency of nuclear use might be different in the real world. We believe that the nuclear dynamics represented here provide useful insights, but readers cannot take the number of nuclear uses, divide by the number of games, and conclude that that is the percentage of nuclear use in a future crisis. There was no Taiwan team because the operational decisions available were limited. However, this meant that we assumed that Taiwan would continue to resist. There was no mechanism for Taiwan to surrender. Many commentators note that China might take other actions against Taiwan other than direct invasion. We don't disagree. If that were to occur, nuclear use would follow a different path, however. And finally, the war games assumed that war had been decided on, but we are not arguing that war is inevitable. However, wars do occur for a variety of reasons, from misestimating the military balance to believing that events were working against them. The Chinese nuclear buildup, the Chinese military buildup and nationalist rhetoric makes such a conflict plausible, but by no means inevitable. This is a very complex chart, which is explained in detail in the report. It shows how the 15 games all started at the same place, but proceeded along many different pathways. I'll make 2 points. The first thing to note is that there were 5 different outcomes shown along the right side of the chart. 3 outcomes were most important. PLA enclave, which allowed the Chinese to maintain an enclave on Taiwan as a result of the invasion. PLA withdrawal, which allowed a defeated Chinese force to retreat from the island. And conflagration, where the two sides climbed the nuclear escalation ladder and ended with a general nuclear exchange. Another point is how uncertain the paths were, the uncertainty of the paths and where they would end up once they started. Now I'll turn the floor over to Eric for his part of the briefing.
In the report, we outline a number of findings and recommendations. I'll just touch on 4 of those today. The first finding is that the games demonstrate a need for diplomatic flexibility and off-ramps. There were no unconditional victories for either side in the conflict. In the games, one of 2 things happened. Either off-ramps were offered at some point in the conflict and the other side agreed, or the teams pressed for total victory with catastrophic consequences. One of our recommendations then is that off-ramps should be a regular part of U.S. planning and wargaming. State Department personnel should be involved in these activities and should be more than mere window dressing. In considering off-ramps, planners should look to achieve important U.S. objectives, but provide at least face-saving means for the adversary to exit conflict. In the games, this sometimes involves allowing China to evacuate isolated soldiers rather than forcing them to surrender. The second finding is that the prospect of imminent defeat was the most important driver of nuclear use. Some call this kind of nuclear use gambling for resurrection. China often found itself in trouble during the conventional fight. By weeks 3 or 4, its amphibious fleet was often largely destroyed, and the China side therefore initiated nuclear use more often than the US did. China's initial nuclear attacks were invariably directed primarily at operational targets on Taiwan. True to the term gambling for resurrection, the game results suggested that nuclear use was very much a roll of the iron dice. That is, using nuclear weapons sometimes improved the outcome for the side employing those weapons. But in 3 cases, escalation ultimately produced general nuclear war, a cataclysm that would have killed hundreds of millions. It may sound obvious that conventional defeat would drive nuclear use, but there are a number of other theories about what might cause nuclear deterrence to fail, and those either did not prove true or played only secondary roles in the games. For example, the availability of tactical nuclear weapons is sometimes said to tempt nuclear use and make it more likely. We played 2 different variants of China's nuclear arsenal. In one case, China had low-yield weapons available to it, and in one, they did not. China teams did consider available weapons yields, especially when discussing potential targets that were near Taiwanese cities. But yields were not a decisive consideration in those cases. Another body of literature suggests that conventional attacks on nuclear or dual-use systems could cause inadvertent escalation to the nuclear level. While we don't dismiss that possibility, we did not see those dynamics in the games. We did vary U.S. rules of engagement, and some games did see attacks against strategic assets. But in all cases, the side being attacked, which was generally China, judged that its essential second strike capability remained intact. Nor did the exhaustion of high-end conventional missiles drive nuclear use. Both sides ran through their missiles quickly, but still had other means of continuing the fight. A third finding was that different U.S. responses to Chinese nuclear first use carried different types of risks and benefits. None of the U.S. teams simply decided to cut and run in the face of Chinese nuclear use. That course would carry the least or lowest nuclear risk, but was seen as having excessive reputation and political cost to the U.S. position in Asia and the globe. Attempting to fight on conventionally was another option, but that generally led to further nuclear use by China and therefore produced poor operational and political outcomes. At the other end of the spectrum, responding with nuclear weapons against targets in China proper proved highly escalatory. In every case where Chinese cities were hit, escalation occurred that led to general nuclear war. Targeting Chinese military units on Taiwan, on the other hand, led to war termination on more positive terms. As an aside, Chinese warships around Taiwan are sometimes said to be lucrative nuclear targets, but for a number of reasons, U.S. teams' responses tended to favor attacks on land units rather than ships at sea. There's a lot more to say about each of these possible responses to Chinese nuclear first use, and we do so in the report. Our recommendation is that well-considered and robust branch plans are critical. Finally, a fourth and final finding is that U.S. nuclear advantage neither deterred China from using nuclear weapons nor proved particularly useful in nuclear bargaining after first use. As long as the China teams believed that they had a survivable second strike capability, which they always did, they were confident that they could engage in nuclear bargaining. Indeed, some teams did that quite successfully. Overall, the conventional balance, and especially the situation on Taiwan, had a greater impact on bargaining leverage. We recommend that the current nuclear modernization plans be executed, but also conclude that expanding the arsenal beyond that point is unlikely to provide decisive leverage in a conflict with China. Again, this is a selective set of points we've discussed, and we invite you to download and read the report, which has more on each of these findings, as well as on other aspects of the game and its results. There's also an audio brief and a 3-minute video available on YouTube.
Thanks, Eric. And now we'll turn the floor over to Matthew and our panel.
Thank you. Well, joining me now, we have 3 great panelists here who actually all participated in the game. Kari and Tong were actually faced each other on one of the iterations. And so they have some great insights both on the project itself and as a result of their scholarship over the years on nuclear and strategic affairs. Dr. Tong Zhao is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment who's written extensively about Chinese nuclear strategy. Kari Bingen is the director of the aerospace project here at CSIS, was the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, and possibly most importantly was an MIT alumni like Eric and myself. And Charlie, our third panelist here, who is currently a senior fellow at MIT after a long career at Chicago, writing about nuclear policy, strategy, and arms racing. So each of the panelists are going to start with their own comments on the game and about what it tells them and about nuclear strategy. And we'll start with Dr. Zhao.
Well, thank you and congratulations. It's a real honor to participate in this exercise and an excellent report. And I want to particularly commend the report for taking a very careful approach, trying not to fit into the Chinese perception that the United States is increasingly preparing for limited nuclear warfare, preparing to fight a nuclear war in a future conflict over Taiwan. But instead, I think it highlights the need that the United States, facing a growing Chinese interest in unifying Taiwan and building up China's nuclear forces, the United States needs to address these new challenges. So it's very clear-eyed in making the observation that nuclear escalation cannot be reliably managed. I think that really helps reduce the Chinese misperception that the United States wants to deliberately lower the threshold of nuclear use and is increasingly preparing for limited nuclear warfare. The report asks a very important question, that is, what happens if nuclear weapons are used? Interestingly, at Carnegie, we also have a project looking at intra-war deterrence. What are the Chinese, American, Russian thinking about controlling nuclear escalation after the threshold is already crossed? It's a very uncomfortable question to consider what happens after nuclear first use, but unfortunately it's becoming increasingly important. The report observes that in these games, nuclear first use was most often initiated by China teams that believed conventional defeat had become inevitable. Obviously, the games were mostly participated by American experts. I wonder if they were played by Chinese nuclear policy experts or military experts, they might have reached different choices and decisions. I think this might also be true in the report's observation that in 6 of the 7 games where China teams initiated nuclear use, they chose to target Taiwanese ground forces. Again, if the game was played by Chinese experts, I wonder if they would prioritize choosing targeting Taiwanese ground forces in their nuclear first use. I think it's still very useful to highlight these observations from the games played by American experts, because it really emphasizes where the perception gaps may exist between American and Chinese security policy communities, and where potential misunderstandings might take place. I think that's really important. One example is, for China, nuclear deterrence is actually a political exercise. If you read Chinese military doctrines, they really emphasize nuclear deterrence as making gestures, making the appearance that China might use nuclear weapons. It's about making nuclear threats and use that threat, use the enemy's concern to achieve its military or even broader geopolitical objectives, while the actual employment of nuclear weapons is only a small part of Chinese concept of nuclear deterrence. And also, when China considers nuclear options, it also considers broader geopolitical factors, including how international public opinion might react to Chinese military choices. The implication is, I think, even militarily meaningful options may not be appealing to Chinese decision makers in the real conflict. For example, a Chinese first use, if that happens, is probably more likely to be a warning shot or a shot over open ocean than directly targeting against U.S. forces or Taiwanese forces. But I think there is still one important risk from that emphasis on making gestures and taking into consideration broader variables. That is, Chinese military really stresses using deceptive tactics to maximize enemy's concern about nuclear use. And they even discuss measures to make fake nuclear missile mobilization or movements to make enemies think China might launch nuclear weapons at locations or at scales that are higher than they actually might intend. So those tactics, I think, carry a risk of causing U.S. misunderstanding and overreaction. Lastly, I want to conclude by again highlighting an important observation in the report, which is the U.S. Should not start a nuclear conflict by using nuclear weapons first during a Taiwan conflict. In the wargame scenarios, it's always against American interest to be the first to initiate nuclear use. I think I very much agree with that observation. If we play the games in details, I think it will become increasingly clear that to prevent a conventional over Taiwan to escalate to the nuclear level is very much in American interest. And therefore, I think that might shed light on other measures, including diplomatic measures that could encourage China to better strengthen its no first use commitment, to increase the credibility of its commitment. Those broader measures may very much in American interest.
Thank you.
Right.
Kari?
Thanks, Matt. And I also want to commend the authors on this series of war games and the rich report. You, Mark, and Matt. I've now played in both the conventional and nuclear games, as red and as blue. And I should say it was an enjoyable experience, but it was rather a sobering one in both cases. I want to preface with an adage. I say it about modeling and simulation, but I'll now say it about war games is all are wrong, some are useful. They're useful to draw insights, but I do want to be careful on absolutes, and I'm glad that Mark and Eric made that point. It's used to stimulate strategic thinking, have hard conversations on tough dilemmas. I think there was real benefit here in you doing it 15 times. It was an opportunity for us and for you to test different strategies and hypotheses. Often the war games that I've participated in, it takes a year or so to build and you get one shot at it. Or it's a conventional war game that the minute it goes nuclear, everyone stops. So I really appreciate that you went through this and that we got to play at that intersection of conventional and nuclear. I'll tell you, I was particularly interested in exploring how we postured and signaled with our nuclear forces concurrent with the conventional battle, how those actions would be perceived by the adversary, and how we perceived their actions. I want to highlight a few things that stood out to me in reading how the other games unfolded and the analysis and the recommendations in the report. I thought it was a very rich, thought-provoking report, and I know we'll be able to get into more of the issues in the discussion. First, I thought the variety of outcomes was healthy. While, of course, I would like to see the U.S. dominate, I would be worried if the U.S. always wins. No outcome produced total victory for either side. And roughly, there was a 50-50 in terms of advantageous outcomes for China, where it established an enclave in Taiwan, or for the U.S., where China withdraws. And several outcomes led to massive nuclear exchange. Second, the shock by the game players at the scale of losses that the United States would take early in a conflict was important to read. That shock then led to bad outcomes for the United States and obviously broader geostrategic implications for us. I think it really showed the value of these war games in sensitizing, it shows the value of war games in sensitizing decision makers to the scale of peer war that we just haven't visually or viscerally seen since World War II. And I would say deterring war is less costly than fighting wars. Third, I would share your emphasis on preparing off-ramps. Neither side achieves a total victory, and especially with regime survival on the line, we shouldn't expect that China will accept defeat. Something our team thought through with each of our building moves, and I played blue this time, it was what could be face-saving off-ramps that keeps Taiwan autonomous, that protects the U.S. homeland, but allows China some victory that they can spin it domestically at home. Maybe it's suppressing Taiwanese independence, but it also might mean taking some risks in the battlefield to gain leverage in those negotiations. Fourth, it was not necessarily surprising to me that nuclear use correlated to conventional defeat. I mean, this was, after all, an existential threat in many cases to the regime, but also that there was a perception of defeat in the U.S. case that they perceived. In one of the cases, there was a perception that the U.S. was headed for defeat. Although I wouldn't characterize nuclear use as a gamble, but it is deliberative and it is calculating. Although we were playing combatant commanders or operational commanders, I could not consider the gravity of the political decision that had to be made and crossing that nuclear threshold. So the dilemma or the balance of the gravity of the political decision that has to be made while also demonstrating credible resolve that we are, without hesitation, willing to use nuclear weapons to deter. I think the least likely scenario is a bolt out of the blue. It is more likely that there would be a buildup from a conventional crisis or conflict. But with each move, I kept thinking, how do you pair an action and a message or narrative? So moving nuclear forces, increasing readiness postures, etc. We were thinking through those, the messaging of those actions, and then the response, both public messaging, private messaging that would need to accompany those actions, both again to show resolve, but also to reduce miscalculation. One recommendation I do want to be careful on is the executing the current nuclear modernization plans provided sufficient tools for a 2028 timeframe. This was a 2028 scenario. Basically, I mean, 3 years from now, we will basically have the weapons that we have today. I would have liked to have played some of the capabilities that are on the horizon, numbers of B-21s with both nuclear and conventional options, and explore how they might complicate China's calculus and give the commander and the president more options. So our options are pretty limited. The Strategic Posture Commission basically recommended, hey, we could do uploading and some other near-term things, but it's pretty limited. I would say, though, nuclear modernization is a long-term endeavor. It will take a decade plus to introduce those new capabilities, so it does require near-term decisions. And I think also, if I take a step back from this war game specifically, the challenge in front of us is the simultaneity of nuclear threats. China's nuclear buildup, Russia, potential opportunism. The current modernization plans and program of record was developed based on a 2010 security environment. So I think that there is, we will have to revisit that because the security environment has changed. A couple quick final points. It was obvious, but the importance here in these games of U.S. calm, and that showed up in one of the earlier charts. There were 2 games where the U.S. panics, and a majority of cases where first use of nuclear weapons was done by China, those generally led to the U.S. folding or an all-out nuclear exchange. This is really worrisome to me. The world looks very different then, and it's not something I would want China to take away from these games. That if they use nuclear weapons first or the U.S. panics, hey, we're in a better position. The importance of intelligence, I'll say with some of my background here, understanding the capability, doctrine, thinking on deterrence, escalation use, what your adversary values the most, where they're vulnerable, the degree of cooperation that we may be seeing between China, Russia, who might be thinking opportunistically. Those are all incredibly important questions for our intelligence community. And then just lastly, I would say this report and your work just continues to highlight the importance of nuclear literacy, needing it, thinking through these issues, not just among just the tremendous scholars that we have at the table and in our community, but that next generation of scholars coming up kind of through the ranks here. I think that's incredibly important, and it was something I know General Cotton emphasized when he was at CSIS a few weeks ago.
Thank you. Charlie?
Great, thanks. Well, I also had the opportunity to play both a conventional and nuclear game, and I learned a lot doing it. And both the earlier commenters have sort of talked about the game in some detail. I wanted to make 2 comments to maybe to put some of this in perspective for people who don't follow the China-Taiwan issue so much, and then a couple comments on the game. So one important thing that's changing the context in the competition between China and the United States is that China is building a much larger and more capable nuclear force. And so unlike 2 or 3 decades ago, where the United States arguably could destroy virtually all of the Chinese force, now it almost certainly can't. And depending upon the timing and scenario, it may have a very large force. And I would argue that in a sense, the United States, once forces are mobilized, that the United States cannot even significantly limit damage. And that's a whole debate, and we can get into that. But that changes the context in a straight scenario, because earlier China might have been deterred by the possibility that the United States was likely to use nuclear weapons or could gain an advantage by launching a massive attack and put China at a major nuclear disadvantage. And now it arguably can't do that. I would say almost certainly can't do that, but some people have a somewhat different view of it. So that's one of the reasons that people think a conventional war is now more likely, is because the nuclear balance or the balance of nuclear capabilities has changed significantly. And so that's one reason to be more worried. Secondly, and not unrelated though, is that the conventional balance has also significantly changed. So where a few decades ago China had very little capability to invade Taiwan, now it at least can imagine winning. And I think your earlier war games show that. So it couldn't be sure it was going to win, but it could plausibly think it might win. And if it was an urgent situation, maybe it would run that risk. And so that's also very different. So just to say these are 2 military technical type reasons that we worry about war being more likely, putting aside what China's desires are, even holding them constant. Second, I would say if a conventional war starts, which is the second step here, then in an important sense, I think China does have an advantage in that I believe it cares more about Taiwan than the United States does. And I think the United States should keep that in mind and be aware of that, which I don't think it works to the United States' disadvantage, but nevertheless it's important. Because sort of traditional standard logic of competition, when both sides have really large forces, the side that cares more can typically win in bargaining. And the argument is there's no difference in capabilities. Both sides can inflict essentially the same amount of damage in an all-out war. So if I'm threatening you with all-out war and you're threatening me with all-out war, the side that cares more will be less willing to back down. And so I think in a certain sense, the United States is in a bad situation over Taiwan, just when you look at it from a military and strategic perspective. Adding in that political point. Now that raises the question, which maybe we'll talk about later, I don't know, is whether the United States should try to regain its nuclear advantage. And we could talk about how hard that is or what the benefits might be. Some people think that it would be valuable to try and regain that advantage even if we couldn't succeed. Just by demonstrating our determination and saying we're doing this to protect Taiwan, that might be valuable. So all of a sudden it's a political issue as well as a military issue. So, but then that wraps into the whole strategy side. So my own feeling is we should not do that. I should say my own judgment is we shouldn't do that, but I think that you can make the case, and there are people who are making that case. And then two quick things on the game. One is I think it's very interesting, but also just a reminder of a very basic thing, which is states are likely to use nuclear weapons if they care enough when they're losing. That's like the most basic reason for escalation. We often think of escalation as coming about from sort of complicated military pressures, like forces are vulnerable, so I'm going to attack because I think you're going to attack. Or I'm going to attack because your conventional attack destroyed some of my nuclear weapons, and so on and so forth. And these are all important, and we should pay attention to them. But at the political level, the most logical reason to escalate is if you think it will help you win the conflict. And I think the report highlights that. I think it's actually a good reminder. I think it's what we're also seeing, by the way, in Ukraine. I don't think Putin is going to use nuclear weapons because the United States used a certain weapon system against Russia or something like that. But if Russia starts to lose, and that could now mean losing territory it holds in Ukraine, so worry about how we define lose, that will be the key. I think will be the key factor. And I would think that would be likely the key factor here in a Taiwan scenario and from the China side. We should also ask about from the U.S. side. The U.S. could also be losing. We don't expect it from these scenarios, but if the United States were losing, would it escalate? Should it escalate? And in a sense, some of the commentary that Eric gave in the beginning said, yeah, maybe we should escalate. The cost would be really too large to our alliances, to our credibility. There's also the possibility that the cost of escalating could be too high. I mean, at that point, both sides are bad, and you have to consider both sides of it. And I think that was something, as well as thinking about off-ramps, we should think about what our interests are if it ever gets to that point. I mean, in a sense, conventional deterrence has failed. Do we want nuclear deterrence to fail? And I can see my time is short here, so I'll just say I've been focusing the last year or so more on the use of tactical nuclear weapons, because the whole nuclear debate in the Cold War, all the fancy arguments were really all about strategic nuclear, the theory of the nuclear revolution is all at that level. And there's sort of this implicit hunch, assumption that tactical use makes strategic use more likely. And there was a lot of concern in Europe, because NATO had a first use, we shouldn't forget, NATO had, and still does officially, have a first use nuclear policy, and that was designed to deter conventional war. But theater forces in Europe were also designed to couple the strategic forces to the theater nuclear forces. But it makes you wonder, what's the logic? Like, if you think that tactical nuclear weapons were used in Taiwan, why would either side then, does that make strategic use more likely? And why? Or is it just an intermediate stage? But either way, the side that was losing, if it cared enough, would use strategic weapons for bargaining in the way that sending signals was talked about earlier. So I think that's something that the game raises as a very important issue that actually deserves more sort of analytic attention broadly in the strategic nuclear or the nuclear debate broadly.
Thanks. I think that's a good question about what is the linkage between a conventional war and strategic nuclear exchanges. Is tactical use or theater use a way station on there? And maybe one element of that is how does that interact with each of the sides' nuclear posture and their declaratory policy and their doctrine? Which sort of leads me to a question I've seen from the audience and that I was thinking about more the meaning of China's declaratory policy, that historically there's been this assured retaliation focus, and there's not been any discussion about nuclear war fighting. Certainly doesn't seem like it's dramatically changing, but it is certainly evolving. When I was playing the games, one of the interesting things for me as not a sinologist was to hear U.S. sinologists debating what China would do and how they would think about this, and it seems like that debate can't really be resolved. But obviously, we should think about what is the meaning right now of no first use, and what direction is it going? Many Americans are skeptical and see it sort of as propaganda. Others have, I think, more sophisticatedly talked about it as something cultural that really does bind Chinese decision making. Could you speak to that a little bit, Dr. Zhao, about where you think no first use is and where it's going?
Sure, and also to the early part of your question, I think China, despite its continued interest in strengthening second retaliation capability, it also is becoming more interested in managing escalation, and that's a new development in China's nuclear thinking. And nothing in China's nuclear philosophy or thinking prevents China from potentially wanting to acquire the capabilities to respond in kind or in proportion at different rounds of the nuclear escalation ladder in the future nuclear war with the United States. And particularly, I think at the theater nuclear level, that's where one major area of U.S. China nuclear competition is going to be. Both sides increasingly worry after initial limited nuclear use at the theater level, they will going to have subsequent nuclear exchanges. I think that is going to drive a major part of both countries' nuclear investment. And that type of competition at the theater level over escalation control or escalation management is inherently destabilizing, can easily spill over to higher levels of nuclear escalation and arms race. No first use is, if you read China's military doctrines, clearly it's more complex than black and white. Particularly, China's declaratory policy does not rule out the threat of nuclear first use. It only renounces nuclear first use. And this is an important point if you compare with China's other declaratory policy, including negative security assurance, which includes both no nuclear use and no threat of nuclear use. But when it comes to no first use, it only includes no actual nuclear use. So it leaves open the option of making nuclear threats and try to exploit the coercive leverage from making nuclear threats. That said, it's also not about total deception, right? There's still a relatively strong and genuine willingness on the Chinese part to implement no first use, and it has real impact on China's operational level nuclear doctrine and its day-to-day training of the missile forces. So relatively strong will to avoid nuclear first use is not absolute commitment to never initiate nuclear first use when China is faced with an existential threat, and Taiwan scenario is very likely to lead to that. No one, would offer absolute commitment, and anyone will be tempted to consider that nuclear option. And by the way, there is no strong institutional check in the China's increasingly centralized system against the leadership making a decision to just initiate nuclear use. But that's not the primary scenario driving current Chinese nuclear thinking. So I think given China's increasing interest in promoting no first use, perhaps it's an opportunity for the U.S. international community to think of ways to help strengthen China's will and interest in no first use, encourage China to also renounce the threat of nuclear first use, to renounce the right to change its nuclear policy in the process, in a crisis. That's currently that option of changing nuclear policy during crisis being reserved in military writings. And also to think of ways to better align China's declaratory policy with its actual development of capabilities and employment operational postures, and also to encourage China to address conventional nuclear linkage, how China needs to provide conventional military assurances to U.S. allies to really reduce their opposition to American no force use. So I think it opens up many potential opportunities for reducing risk and minimizing the risk of nuclear conflict.
Kari, could you pull on that thread about how the U.S. could engage with China or something else?
Well, I wanted to build off of, I think, when you look at China's nuclear force today, you could say, okay, that doctrine, that policy, it makes sense. I'll say what worries me is as I read these non-classified reports and testimony on where it's going over the next 5 to 10 years, that force composition in quantity and quality looks very different than it does today. And so then at what point, with the arsenal of the kit that they have, will they go back and say, I need to revisit my policy and doctrine because it doesn't match all the different tools that I have available to me now in the nuclear front?
Yeah, a big question is to what extent is this an action-reaction cycle, or is this sort of coming from China's internal pressures, or where do these changes come from? What are some ways that maybe a new administration could explore ways to shape that evolution that's coming down the line? Maybe Charlie or Kari, one of you want to take a swing?
You mean specifically on first use or on nuclear posture?
And or take it any direction you want, but that we would want, seeing these changes in hardware, we would want to be able to change or have some influence on China to encourage a mutual understanding to prevent misunderstandings during crisis. And what I just heard, if I heard correctly, was that there might be some opportunities for the U.S. to increase its engagement on that account. What are some ways that you think?
Well, I take a different angle on misunderstandings just because I think it's a related issue, and I know less about sort of the evolution of the theater. But if people think that China, in a decade, is going to have a force comparable to the U.S. force at the strategic level, and in a prior bipolar balance, that was more or less okay. Although it's important for people who don't follow nuclear to know that the United States was always trying to destroy the Soviet force, and we always had that type of targeting, not sort of this other sort of counter-value image that is counter-city image that's often part of. So we always sort of had a competitive nuclear strategy anyway, but in various ways parity was acceptable, even if not really at the operational level. One of the big issues now is that we face two nuclear peers, or coming of two nuclear peers, and so have large nuclear forces on both in China and Russia. And so the question is how the United States needs to respond to that. I've taken a rather minority view on this, which is, but it comes down to the basics of nuclear doctrine, which is what do you need for deterrence? And if you're not going to try to have a damage limitation capability, not try to destroy the adversary's force, and you're just thinking in terms of the number of weapons that are required to do massive retaliatory damage, then you get a very different answer. So the sort of conventional growing wisdom in Washington is we need a force that can deal simultaneously with both forces, but also by attacking those forces, in which case we will need a force that's larger or as large as the combined force. My view is that's wrong, but if we go down that route, or even if we just continue to try and challenge China's ability to have a massive retaliatory capability, that creates it does create all sorts of time pressures and fears in a crisis. And I know it didn't come up in the game, but it could come up in a game where basically both sides are looking at the other side, get their forces ready for attack. In a conventional war, there may have been a certain number of satellites that are important for your communication that are lost, all sorts of complications. And I think the traditional concerns, even though I said I think the most important escalatory concern is losing, I think the traditional concerns about the pressures that are created between highly capable forces targeted at each other are dangerous and reduce time for communication and reduce the time for finding off-ramps and create pressures for escalation earlier in a crisis than later. So it would be rather major change for the United States, but I still think it's a good policy in a minority view, and that it would sort of take a lot of the steam out of the competition. It would be good politically, but it also would have a variety of advantages in crisis.
Right, that a U.S. shift from a counterforce policy towards and an explicitly nuclear counterforce that we are trying to disarm our damage limitation towards a counter-infrastructure, counter-value policy would slow down crisis negotiation and
It would allow time for
allow
crisis.
time.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, and I should have said, I mean, I don't, and once again, I think that having that kind of doctrine and strategy doesn't mean that the only option you have is an all-out, counter-society attack. And there are a lot of different steps that could be demonstrations or against, not very valuable targets or isolated targets. But the whole idea is that, once again, you're that bargaining kind of situation that is, to me, is the natural logic of extremely high vulnerability. But we're not headed and haven't been headed in that direction.
So I take a slightly different. I take your point. We've long had a counterforce strategy. The other end of the spectrum is counter value. I think you're arguing something in between. I would argue something in between too, but maybe slightly differently. And if I agree, is we can't sit here and do the math and say, okay, Russia has 2, China has 2, therefore the U.S. must have 4. I don't know that I've heard folks making that argument. But we've long, across administrations from a bipartisan perspective, have long maintained a counterforce strategy that does, it doesn't mean 2 + 2 have to equal 4, but it does mean the Department of Defense has to go through, I'll say a requirements process, right? Is what are those targets that we need to be able to hold at risk, do the math, and then come up with what that looks like. But it may not be 2 + 2 = 4. I also just want to hit on your question on the mutual understanding. I think this is really important, and I agree with that recommendation. We have to figure out a way to engage in a dialogue with China. Track 1, 1.5, 2, that has become de minimis lately. I from an American perspective, say and I would really value Tong's thoughts here too, but I just have not seen Beijing show much propensity to want to engage in a dialogue at this point in time. They've shown no interest in an arms control dialogue. So it can't be one-sided, but I think we both need to figure out a way to do it, to be able to manage crisis, escalation management, misunderstandings, etc. So, yeah.
Do you have maybe some, to pick up that thread, ideas about specific things that the U.S. Could do to facilitate? I mean, there are continued track 1.5, so even maybe moving towards track 1 discussions. One of Beijing's talking points is that the U.S. refuses to acknowledge mutual vulnerability. There's some concerns that, well, if the U.S. acknowledged mutual vulnerability, then Beijing would just take that to the bank and not reciprocate. Do you think that there are good formulations for the U.S. to get around that concern and to start some of these trust building between the two sides?
We don't know whether Chinese government is still seeking a U.S. declaratory commitment to mutual vulnerability. Because ultimately, the U.S. in various places, occasions have made indirect statement to that effect, indicating U.S. does not intend to use missile defense or other conventional capabilities to deliberately undermine China's second strike. But those reassurances so far have not worked to really convince China. So it can be a topic of discussion in bilateral track 1 or track 2 conversations, just to get Chinese feedback on if they want some type of strategic reassurance along the line of mutual vulnerability or strategic stability, etc. What are the concrete measures, the format of the reassurance that it is seeking from the United States? A similar discussion that we can have with China on no first use. How do you make your no first use policy credible? Right? How does your credibility manifest when it comes to specific capabilities and operational postures? I think it's constructive to have that type of discussion. It also helps deepen China's own thinking on those issues. When it comes to managing escalation, I do think there are risks that may not be viewed similarly from the two sides. For example, counter-value strike, especially nuclear strike against population centers, they may spare China's nuclear forces and be viewed by the United States as not particularly escalatory. But for China, I think the leadership really cares about their public opinion, and if large number of Chinese casualties are caused, it might be much harder for the leadership to pursue de-escalation. I think, again, it's perhaps useful to discuss with China and try to understand each other's views on the level of escalation, on the significance of each escalatory step. What do they mean to each other, to get some clear understanding of Chinese views, and also use conversations to shape or help China develop more accurate understanding of American red lines and American interpretations of escalation. It's hard to reach formal agreement under current circumstances, but through unilateral statements, research publications, and tractor dialogues, I think U.S. can help clarify its own red line and its own expectations of certain escalatory behaviors.
I guess that's another good question for us is, right, when does the U.S. envision inadvertent escalation, where we've spoken to the Chinese about the importance of space-based infrared satellites? The people in the audience, we have a question about how do hypersonics, like they're mentioning Russia's hypersonics, but obviously we have our own, China is developing some. And what is the intersection between these sort of emerging threats, hypersonics, and emerging theaters, where space is now increasingly important between the two sides? I don't know, Kari, if you wanted to take a stab at, in the war game, certainly the U.S. attacks on the Chinese mainland and inadvertent escalation didn't ring, but if there's a possibility for that in the future to change, and how we should think through communicating that with the other side.
Yeah, maybe I'll go two different directions with that. On the hypersonics one is, I think it was in our game that we played, Blue actually, I think we had hypersonic missiles in 2028.
Yeah.
We targeted Chinese, I think, command and control nodes. And I forget the exact circumstances of how our game evolved, but we still wanted to hold kind of U.S. nuclear use. Luckily, we had more options.
Yeah.
We had those strategic hypersonic missiles. And so I think as we go forward here, there's no longer just, I'll say, theater conventional weapons and then go right to nuclear. Is we are seeing a broader array of strategic or capabilities with strategic effects, whether they be hypersonic, conventional, space, cyber, that a commander would also have at their disposal. So I think that's a good thing. It maybe creates more rungs on the escalatory ladder. On the mention on space, it was interesting. During the Cold War, there was this general understanding between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. We don't touch each other's missile warning or nuclear command and control satellites. Would allow both sides to maintain that ability to absorb a strike, do a second strike, and be able to command their forces across the globe. We just don't have that same understanding today with China, and I do think a lot of it stems back to we haven't been able to have those. We haven't had those kind of dialogues or discussions. So it is worrisome. We have concentrated our space architecture, as General Hyten would say, into these big, fat, juicy targets in space. China is developing a range of counter space weapons, everything from cyber and jamming up to kinetic missiles or orbiting weapons that can maneuver. Those nuclear satellites are no longer considered off limits. And they also have value not just strategically, but tactically at the theater level. So that is a big challenge, I think, for our space community now. And what they're grappling with is how do we make changes to our architecture through proliferation? How do we look now at hardening? How do we look at investments in greater defenses? How do we look at offensives to deny the others their use of space? I think all of that is on the table. But it then also has to be paired with that diplomatic engagement piece as well.
Yeah, sure.
So I just say, I think understandings would be good, but I also think, and are important, but I think if one side saw a large advantage in a war, particularly in a conventional war, to disabling the other side's space assets, it would be strongly inclined to do so. And what would the understanding be? Well, it's not fair, and what would be unfair about it? It might not be a good move, but so I think that both sides have to worry about that. I think it's two-sided, and I'm a little skeptical that understandings are the solution in the sense that both sides will actually look at it in terms of capabilities. One thing, and I know James Acton at Carnegie especially, but a lot of people are worried about the connection, the interaction between, and the entanglement between space assets that are good for conventional and nuclear. And so both sides, when they think about is this a good decision, should be deeply educated about the nuclear implications of attacking satellites to undermine the adversary's ability to perform conventional missions. And I think that's something we need to learn more about. It's incredibly complicated, at least to the not very technical eye. But I think it's good to have these conversations. It's good to have these understandings. But if you get into a big war, I think the capabilities are going to dominate. I don't think, in other words, and there's no real logic in a way to sort of saying we won't attack space assets. On its face. Any more than it would be to say any other asset, unless you understand them to be especially escalatory, in which case you wouldn't do it, but not because of because you can't understand that it's too dangerous, not because it's somehow inappropriate. I don't mean to put words in your mouth.
No, and it was really interesting to me looking at all of these different games that were played. Those high-altitude nuclear detonations that went after space were treated differently than nuclear detonations on Earth. But I'll say, as a space person, that's a horrible day. That's a horrible outcome because you are affecting everything you're doing on the ground that relies on those space capabilities. But you're right. It is vulnerable. The DoD China report talks about China may consider to go after C4ISR first. A lot of that's in space.
Of course.
Well, and I guess I would say maybe it's not so much that, both sides, there should be one way of thinking through these things, and that if both sides come to the same conclusions about the value of attacking space, then they're just going to do it. I guess I'm still an optimist, about creating mutual understanding that even if China thinks differently, we might both think differently about these risks of inadvertent escalation, but that the other side would at least understand that if you go after my satellites, this is the way I would interpret it, right? And you might interpret it very differently if I goes after yours, and we don't have to agree. I don't have to educate you on, and bring you to my opinion, but that if at least I know, then there'd be somebody in the case of war. I guess as a closing thought here, I'd like to go back to Charlie about, we talked about some of the gaps in our understandings, how would theater or tactical nuclear weapons lead to strategic? What's the role of war games or other analyses? What are sort of the next steps you think for academia and for think tanks in terms of building this nuclear literacy that everybody says has vanished or has subsided, and then answering the pressing policy questions that Stratcom and other people are looking for?
I'll take one piece of that, which is just the literacy part, not the war game part, because I think you guys. Well, I get one quick thing on the war game, which is I think that there is a question about what level of detail the game has to operate to start to think about these escalatory dangers. Like, you're playing the game, but it's pretty calm. There's not sort of all this chaos around you.
Yeah. I suggested that we should, cut open a chicken and throw it on the table.
Yeah, lots of surprise and not tell people how to.
Yeah, right.
And But I wonder what if there some of these pressures would be if the game were sort of still at a more operational level, whether some of these pressures would manifest themselves. I don't know, but I'm just wondering at what level you need to be worrying or thinking about it. But in terms of literacy, I will say that being an old guy, that a lot of the nuclear basics were developed quite well during the Cold War. And so that literature is out there, and I think it needs to be extended to think about three-party, two peers, or, but the core logic that Schelling and other people worked out in the 50s and 60s is still pretty much the core logic, in my view. And then, of course, you have to take it and apply it to any particular case. But it's not like, well, now we're in a new decade, so we need a whole variety of new arguments. I do think there is a gap at the tactical level, as I mentioned. I mean, I think that because so much of the nuclear strategy was developed in the Cold War, it was, even though it was done in a very general way, a lot of it had Europe in mind. And so tactical weapons had a very specific role that they played in Europe, or a very murky role, but a very large role. But it could be very different elsewhere. And so it would be good to think about whether there's that gap is different if you think about it in a more in a situation when the forces are not forward deployed, when they're used in relatively small numbers, when they're used specifically for certain reasons. I think all that would be good, but just to sort of beat a dead horse, so to speak, I think a lot of the really basic questions come back to doctrinal debates that we've had for a really long time. And I take it, often people say, well, Stratcom's going to say this, or the Pentagon says we have to do it this way, and that is all true, but that does reflect the fork in the road that was taken a long time ago and doesn't mean it's the right one. So, if we're regaining this literacy, I think it's good to come back to those issues. I just say, I don't ever think that like counter value or even just like low-level counter infrastructure strikes wouldn't be incredibly escalatory. I think the value of them is that they clearly would be incredibly escalatory, and therefore you would think of it on that way and maybe decide to not act, and the other side would understand them as such. Where some people somehow think that a large counterforce attack, which could easily be a couple thousand weapons, is less escalatory. And that's not at all clear to me, because that counterforce attack probably attacks, command and control and everything, and it does a huge amount of damage. But somehow that one is like less emotionally and politically challenging than a very small counter infrastructure attack. I think that's wrong. Substantively, but it is the way people think about it, and so it's why I come back to this. But I don't mean to imply at all that it wouldn't be incredibly escalatory, but that's its purpose. At that point, what you're doing is threatening escalation. Just say it.
Yeah. And it's true. There's some games where people will say, well, we're going to do a counterforce, but they define counterforce as attacking military targets in major population centers, and that this is turns out, nobody makes this distinction that is not escalatory because you hit the factory, in the middle of the city and not the population itself. Kari and Tong, any parting thoughts on either where scholarship should go or other thoughts?
Three quick things that we haven't talked as much about is just, I'm really glad you played allies in this game in particular. I think we had a Japan cell.
Yeah.
So greater assurance to allies. I see this in many of my dialogues with our partners. That is an incredibly important piece to this, and I'm glad you played it. Two is, Charlie mentioned this at the outset, I think, Tong did, on the intra-war deterrence. Our colleagues at Project on Nuclear Issues here at CSIS have done a fantastic series on intra-war deterrence and strategies for how do you, after nuclear uses happen, how do you de-escalate, how do you still achieve your outcome? So I'd commend that to folks. And then the third piece is just on this conventional nuclear integration. As we played these, it spoke so loudly to me of, I can envision a regional combatant commander, leading, obviously will be leading the fight, but you're going to have much tighter integration with strategic command, with cyber command, with space command, planning, operations. All of that is going to have to happen. I think that's a big push that we have to make within the Department of Defense.
Yeah, 100% what I see is a lot of discussion about conventional support of nuclear operations, and yet there's this reverse of nuclear support of conventional operations that seems to come out very importantly in these scenarios, and absolutely something to think through.
In terms of nuclear literacy, I do think it's increasingly important for U.S. strategic policy communities to look deeper into their rival countries' nuclear thinking and discussions. I don't think China has seen any capability weakness in current U.S. nuclear capability, both at the strategic level and the theater tactical nuclear weapons level. They still fear a lot about U.S. capabilities at both levels. So if U.S. decides to invest more in nuclear capabilities, I think there's a huge opportunity cost at conventional U.S. conventional capability, and eventually it's the conventional capabilities as war games show that have a much more decisive impact in determining the war results. I think China will increasingly have capability and willingness to also develop its own nuclear escalation control policies. And here it's impossible to set the rules officially, but I think through, again, track 1, track 2 dialogues, the U.S. can, I think, establish some tacit or implicit rules, making it clear that certain way to conduct a nuclear war, to escalate, is irresponsible and should be totally forbidden. That would be red line for the United States. I think those discussions help even think tank research. This report, they are going to be closely followed by Chinese nuclear policy experts and will shape future Chinese thinking on these issues. And the good news is, as China's capability grow, including its own development of space-based early warning satellites, infrastructure, it will, I think, be more likely to appreciate some of the escalation risks that has been worrying the United States. And looking forward, we can jointly conduct research with Chinese counterparts to explore how new technologies, hypersonic missiles that can maneuver and change trajectory, how conventional nuclear dual-capable missiles will complicate nuclear postures like launch and warning that China is on path to developing. So those might be areas for fruitful discussion and engagement.
I think that's a great note to end on, that, and going back to the early literature, even though U.S. and China are competitors, we also have shared interests, most notably in avoiding nuclear war, and that anything that we can do to work towards that end is critically important. And so with that, I think we'll end. I want to thank all the panelists at CSIS and the MIT Wargaming Lab for sponsoring this event. And I encourage everyone to go online and to read the report at csis.org. And thank you very much.